Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kristen Easterday, Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and I'm also on CMC's Board of Trustees. Today's forum is the latest in CMC's Developing a Dynamic Downtown, presented by the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation and Capital South, and sponsored by Thompson Hine. Thank you. We are also grateful to the sponsors of today's program, the Harrison Smith Legacy and Civic Engagement Fund, Recognizing Excellence in Downtown Development, Smith and Hale, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, and MKSK. And thank you as well to our host, the Ellis and the Columbus Dispatch, for supporting today's forum. Lastly, we want to thank the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting our live stream being carried on right now on our social media channels. Let's thank everyone supporting today's forum. So welcome to the program officially, reattaching historic neighborhoods to downtown Columbus. What freeways divided in Columbus, freeway caps are attempting to heal. I-71 and I-70 severed the Brewery District and German Village from downtown in the 1960s. Now, a massive project is underway to reconnect these neighborhoods to the heart of the city. To introduce today's topic and our panelists, please help me welcome my friend, an amazing poker player, Amy Taylor, from our presenting sponsor, the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation. Amy, the podium is yours.
Believe me, Kristen has taken more than my fair share of money, so she is the amazing poker player. I'm so pleased to be here because this has been something I think everyone on this panel has been talking about in so many rooms, and it's nice to have them all collected here together in this one room. When the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation, my colleague Greg Davies and I did the strategic plan back in 2022, we had the privilege of working with Andrew Overbeck and Chris Herman on that, and we heard from the community that one of the key things they wanted to make sure of as we look at the future of downtown is that we connected to the near neighborhoods. And they felt that that relationship had to be truly symbiotic. It had to value and have a benefit for downtown, but equally, we had to look at all of the culture, all of the richness that's occurring in our near neighborhoods and try to bleed that into downtown as well. And I think we've done a great job with the Short North. Tom Slack certainly has led that with that connection over the cap and everything that happened at the convention center. But there's so many more opportunities. When we look at King Lincoln Bronzeville, when we look at German Village and the Brewery District, and we look at through the peninsula to Franklinton. And so I'm really excited to hear what they have to say, and it's my pleasure to quickly introduce them. First, we've got my friend Bhakni Banya. She is the CEO of BBC Design. We've got Chris Herman. He's a principal at MKSK. Chris Hune, immediate past president of the German Village Society. Benjamin Perriman, and he's the Endangered Properties Fund Director for the Columbus Landmarks Association. Tom Slack, Capital Programs Administrator for the Ohio Department of Transportation. And then our host, I'm pleased to introduce, returning to the moderator role, is Mark Ferenchek with the Columbus Dispatch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. I think we're going to have a good discussion today. Freeways have been a part of our lives forever. I don't know that any of us have been around since, or not too many of us rather, since the freeways were built. They disconnected neighborhoods, though, from downtown, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that. At first, I want to talk to Benjamin and ask him about the history of what happened and what that meant in terms of the disconnect between downtown and the neighborhoods, not only just physically, but psychologically as well, and the concerns about that over the years.
Thanks for having me today. When we speak about our transportation infrastructure in Columbus, oftentimes we don't necessarily consider it to be a physical manifestation of the ideas that came from redlining and insurance maps, et cetera. And in that process, the divides that we understand through the concept of redlining have remained through the infrastructure that was built during that moment in time, as well as experiencing a loss of the architectural and historical record that existed in all of the areas in which it was built over. And as we look to reconnect to downtown and consider our future, we really have to revisit the underlying factors that led to that division. And so the division that we want to heal within our neighborhoods was actually an intentional thing that we're looking to find an intentional solution for. And so when you live in the neighborhoods that have been separated from downtown, whether it be the South Side, Linden, German Village, you'll also notice it's almost perfect the way that the vertical highway separates the lateral access to downtown. And so as we consider things like the cap, et cetera, it's important to consider how that creates opportunities for the neighborhoods as well to be a part of the city, as opposed to this feeling of exclusion you get when you walk across empty concrete overpass.
I wanted to ask now Tom Slack and also Chris Herman about the caps that and the bridges that are being built that will connect German Village and the Brewery District with the southern side of downtown Columbus. We're talking about Front Street, High Street, 3rd and 4th Streets, and you are all obviously are aware of the cap that was built over I-670 almost 20 years ago now, and the big difference that made in terms of the look and the feel of the neighborhood connecting downtown to the short north. I'm sure you've also traveled the Long Street Bridge and the Cultural Wall there, and what a difference that's made in that area. Tell us a little bit about what's planned now for the new caps and bridges, timetables, what they're going to look like, and what that can mean.
Certainly, Mark. Thank you. And really great to have this forum here today. You're absolutely correct about the history. And there's nothing we can do to undo those decisions, but to work together collectively to make those changes now as we're working on the freeways and focusing on those connections. And the High Street cap, just north of the Convention Center, was our first foray into that. 20 years ago, actually, we were celebrating the reopening of 670 in September of 2003. So we've gone through the 20-year anniversary, and about that time, we moved our focus to the south and east sides of downtown and what we could do with those connections on the 70-71 overlap and then the portion of 70 on the east side. We are in a very great situation here that we got so much community involvement, particularly on the east side with Spring and Long, and I'll let Chris talk a little bit more about his experiences there. And we have such a great proof of concept for providing different kinds of connections for our downtown to and from our neighborhoods. Think about Long Street, Spring Street, and Broad Street all have some different components in there. We're going to want to use those here as the different neighborhoods to have that different type of neighborhood feel, not be a one-size-fits-all, and try to interact and get that type of interaction and personality of the neighborhoods in a freeway project. It's something that was unheard of 20 years ago, to do these kind of things in a transportation project, and it's really been exciting and a great pleasure to work on that type of improvement for the neighborhoods, for the community, as part of a freeway project. Chris, if you want to talk a little bit about again, what you've been working on, the design details.
So Tom and I are two of the older people related to this project. I think it's one of the things I would like to stress to you is how long these projects take. I like to think about the inner belt, 670, 71, and 70, at least those three sides, as kind of one long effort. And the 670 reconnection, that was planning in the 90s. And the stuff that we're talking about on the south side was being planned 2004 to 2012 design. So these take a long time and a lot of money and a lot of people being involved. But I think because of the community interest in the historic neighborhoods on the north end when 670 was being done, and really strong support from Columbus City Council and a willingness by ODOT to say, all right, we made mistakes in the past, but we're going to try to do something now as we rebuild these. That's where we got Jack Luck stepped up. The community all said we wanted to see something improved. David Maleka did the architecture. We got this great cap at Union Station that transformed our feeling and connection between those neighborhoods. Using that, we had conversations 2004, 2005, 2006 about what the rest of this arc was going to look like. And we talked about the lessons learned. At this time, things like Boston Big Dig were going billions of dollars bearing the freeway. A lot of people wanted to do that here, but we didn't have those kind of resources. But I think what we did stumble on was a Columbus approach, which I think more cities all over the country need to be following, which is, and we heard this in the community, let's invest money on the bridge crossings and make those connections better for people to walk, to bike, reflect those neighborhoods, and hide the freeway. And we can focus the money on each of the bridges, and by doing that, we can make the connections better, but we also can use the limited resources we have. And so ODOT, Columbus, Morpsey stepped up, and the community all gave us lots of great guidance and helped us prioritize the bridges. And so Long Street's a great example of a cap, but done as a green space. High Street in the short north is a great example of a cap with a building on it. We have Spring Street and others that are being done as very attractive, wider bridges with those lit panel walls that really screen the highway. And so taking those kits apart, we continue to apply them all the way around 70 and 71. And so the exciting thing on the south side, Front Street Bridge is down right now, but it's going to get rebuilt. It will have a 40-foot cap on the east side of it that'll make the pedestrian crossing much more attractive and reflect some of what is in the Brewery District there in Franklin County. High Street will be a green park cap, 60-foot caps on either side that will reconnect Franklin County campus and downtown with the Brewery District and German Village. 3rd Street, the city's working very hard, and for any developers or those of you that know developers, to have conversations about getting somebody willing to build a building on the 3rd Street and make a building cap at 3rd Street like we've done over 670 at High Street. And then 4th Street will also be an attractive bridge. So making those fantastic connections, and I know I'm taking up too much time. Last piece that's really important is by taking out the ramps at 3rd and 4th, we are gaining ground, terra firma, to make a better connection between German Village and downtown. And we're taking all the ramps that used to empty out onto Livingston Avenue out. This is going to allow the transformation of Livingston Avenue into a two-way street all the way from the east all the way into downtown. It will have bike lanes. It will be pedestrian. We'll actually have room to add development on the north side in places, so it'll be a two-sided street. Livingston Avenue here in the next 20 years will be a next great street, I think, for Columbus.
So I was going to ask Tom a little bit more about just the timetable for all of these projects and also the cost. You know, if you could let people know how much these types of things cost as part of the overall $1.5, $1.6 billion freeway reconstruction that you're doing in downtown Columbus.
Yeah, that's correct. There is a lot involved. As Chris alluded to, City of Columbus and the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission have both put significant amounts of dollars to the tune of $20 to $30 million apiece towards some of these enhancements for the street level enhancements. From a time standpoint, as I mentioned, the Front Street Bridge already under construction. It takes some time to build these while we're also working on the freeways at the same time. That closure is more than a year. It's more like 2 years. We'll be doing 3rd, 4th, and High over the next 5 to 6 years. We're in the process right now of getting those contracts put into place. The designs are complete. But wanting to do those in sequence. We're not going to close all 3 of them at once. We need to still maintain the ability to get across the freeway during construction, but we're working through right now actually the details on those sequences to make sure that we can keep the connections during construction. But yes, you're going to see activity on the south side of Columbus between downtown and German Village and Brewery District through the rest of this decade.
I wanted to ask Bhakti now about the importance of just the fabric. How would this connect downtown to German Village and the Brewery District in terms of the impact and also just the aesthetics there and the design? How important are those types of things to a project like this?
I think, when I think about the caps and just necessarily like how they're different. For me, what's important is the interstitial spaces between these communities. We have these great neighborhoods. We have German Village, Brewery District, we have Franklinton, we have the Short North, and we have downtown. And I feel like downtown is kind of that central point which can connect and organically link all of our neighborhoods. And I think Columbus as a city, we have these great neighborhoods, but the spaces in between are sort of lost a little bit sometimes. You don't have that smooth transition. And I think about, 20 years ago, when you went from the Short North, let's say, to campus, or from the Short North to downtown, you definitely felt that middle space where you were like, oh, I'm between those two. And now, because of the cap and because of all of that development that's gone north and south from the Short North, it feels very continuous and very seamless, even though each individual neighborhood has its own character and its specialness. I would love to see that happen with downtown and all of the other neighborhoods, and I think the caps are going to help. One thing I feel like, the freeways have definitely devastated neighborhoods as they were built, but the unique thing I think about downtown and our freeway to the south and to the north is it's kind of hidden. It's below street level. So it makes it a little bit easier to weave back the fabric of the downtown and the streets by connecting these streets. And the more you feel like they're street grids and not bridges, I think architecturally and just spatially, you're going to feel more seamless. And I think the more you ignore the highway as much as possible visually, I think you're going to get that effect. So I'm really glad to hear there's green space involved in the caps. There's potentially buildings, because then you tend to forget that you're actually crossing a bridge, and it becomes from one to the other. Anecdotally, we're renovating a building on South High Street, which is very close to the High Street cap, and it's the Schlee-Kemmler building, some of you may know. And Schlee was a brewer, and when we first were looking at the building, I was confused about why there was a brewer here and Brewery District is over there. And now when you think about it, it probably was all the same neighborhood before the highways went through, right? So that history is there. We just need to kind of make all of that seem more together rather than separate neighborhoods that are disconnected.
Thank you. I was going to ask Chris Hune. Oh, go ahead, Benjamin. Yeah.
I was going to speak about the loss of connectivity, where there's breweries outside of the Brewery District now. And when you think about some of the other neighborhoods in Columbus, particularly for me, the first one that comes to mind is North and South Linden, separation from Clintonville, where a lot of those homes were built in similar periods of time. And the experience of living in those neighborhoods had a lot of connectivity before the highways. And so when you look at the legacy of the highway and the differences that we see between those two neighborhoods, I think that it's also important to consider how some of the neighborhoods that aren't necessarily our marquee, like commercial districts, how we can reconnect the history of those neighborhoods as well, and consider the histories and how they can be reconciled.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Chris Hune from German Village. So German Village is one of our best known neighborhoods, obviously well preserved, lots of visitors, lots of traffic. But how can German Village and the Brewery District benefit by these caps that may not be there right now?
So German Village and Brewery District are primarily residential areas, and we want to use our downtown. I'm a 30-year resident of German Village, and I've seen a renaissance from the downtown being primarily a commercial district to now being very much a residential district as well, and the parks and so forth that have evolved with the Commons and Bicentennial Park and all the additional activities that are going down there. And I know German Village residents, we like to utilize those, so we will go into downtown. So we also have plenty of activities within German Village. We welcome everybody to come to, as we always tout it, our very walkable neighborhood. So anything that connects us from village to downtown, to Franklinton, to the Short North is of benefit to all of us.
I'm sorry, this is for anybody. So you're talking about connectivity between these neighborhoods, and we're talking about the possibility of buildings on the 3rd Street cap. what should those buildings look like? How could they be designed and built so they seamlessly, to some extent, connect the neighborhoods to the south with downtown? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, all right, I was waiting for my mic. I'd be happy to take that. When we kind of look at the precedent for the CAP, the short north, it's actually modeled to look like the old train station that was demolished in the 70s and replaced by the convention center. In Columbus Landmarks, that's actually the first project that actually led to our formation. So when we consider the historical context of neighborhoods and thinking about what's been lost, the CAP in the short north is actually a perfect example of how it's an acknowledgement of the history and loss, but also looking to supplement that loss with something that works for the needs of today. And I think that when we get to 3rd Street and consider the rich history of all the neighborhoods that have been separated from downtown, whether it be like the South Side, German Village, Hungarian Village, there's rich cultures in those neighborhoods that can really be highlighted through this opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of dialogue that we can draw from that.
I'd just like to piggyback onto what he said, is that, you know, there is such a rich history, and there's been so much, and I have to say selfishly, because I am representing German Village, that German Village has taken such measures to preserve our history, and there's a strong history to tell. And I think there's a perfect opportunity, and you could kind of go back to what was done with the Longstreet Bridge, CAP, and the way they captured the history and the people who made that area vibrant and to what it is today. So, so incorporating that component into the history of those neighborhoods as you start heading south would be really beneficial.
Another thing I wanted to mention was there is a zoning overhaul being done by the City of Columbus currently, and I wonder if you could kind of marry some of these connectors that we're doing with looking at those points of connection and maybe increasing density in those locations. So looking at what, what the infrastructure is, but how can we then now put a little bit more emphasis from a zoning standpoint, give more density to those neighborhoods so those really enrich kind of that connection investment that we're making and make those sort of, set them up for success in a way, because sometimes there may be connecting into neighborhoods that aren't that dense at that point. And for us to feel that you're transitioning from a neighborhood to a neighborhood, I think that density needs to kind of be consistent a little bit. So I think that would be a really fun way to kind of look at that zoning and how we're implementing that or influencing those neighborhoods that we're connecting into.
Also, it's important to know a lot goes into the design of a CAP. I could talk about that for a long time, but basically, you got to think about front doors, you got to think about building placement, you got to think about how big the building is, how much weight the bridge can support. So the bridge needs to be designed for the building that's going to be on it. Ideally, that's why I think the city wants to talk about what happens on 3rd, because you want the development and the design of the bridge to happen at the same time as you're designing the building. And there's a lot of requirements on what can be over an interstate. You'll notice if you look at the CAP over the High Street, on High Street over 670, it's got blank walls. That was because there was requirements to not have anything that distracted drivers down below. There was a weight requirement based on that design, which is why it's made out of the materials it's made out of. If you design that, we can design a bridge to hold a bigger structure, but that just raises the cost. So there's got to be all that kind of factored in. Another thing for those of you when you walk across the CAP at Union Station, the bridge for traffic carries a live load. The engineers and architects in this room are going to understand this. The bridge carries a live load, so it has a camber, and it has to be able to take moving weight. And so the CAP over 670 is actually 3 bridges. There's a center bridge, which is the road bridge, and there's 2 flat platforms attached to it on either side. And you can actually notice it if you look really carefully when you're walking on it. So the bridge for cars has a camber. The bridge for the buildings is straight. So at each end, there's steps. And that's why you have that arcade. That's on the flat bridge, the building bridge. You step up and you walk all the way across. But to meet ADA in the middle, where the camber of the road bridge meets the flat pieces of either side of the building bridge, it levels out, and that is a flat transition between the sidewalk and the arcade. All that had to be carefully designed to think about things like ADA access and the fact that we're doing live loads on the main bridge, we're doing dead loads on the building sides of the bridge. All that has to go in. So it's really complex. Seems like it should be a really obvious thing, but a lot goes into it. And you think about water and sewer, you think about service and delivery, think about parking. We'd like to say that we don't need any parking, but for some of these kind of things that we're talking about to succeed, we have to think about how we do all those things.
20 years of this, and I think we're finally turning Chris into an engineer.
Yeah.
We've spoken a lot about the bridges that are being built between downtown and the neighborhoods, but in the midst of this, I actually realized that there are some really key points where we're actually dealing with overpasses as well, and I think that that's something important to bring into the conversation. So I live in King Lincoln, Bronzeville, and where most of the divide with 71 exists, you can actually see to the other side, even though you can't necessarily cross because we're dealing with a lowered roadway. Whereas once you get further north into the neighborhood towards Fort Hayes, you're actually dealing with these massive concrete walls that divide you from spaces. And I'm thinking about a lot of the neighbors that I have, like a lot of young people of color who go to school at Columbus State or might be enrolled at Fort Hayes. And you can really tell the intentionality in which those institutions were separated from the people who depend on them most in those areas, where it is almost more pleasant to ride from the suburbs to Columbus State in a car and just get off on the highway than it is to walk less than a mile from King Lincoln, Bronzeville to Columbus State. And I think that there's an importance to not just thinking about like the economic and kind of like recapturing land, but also thinking about the experiential components of what it means to cross those spaces every day and what's being internalized for the people who live there.
Those are some great points with respect to 71 further north. So much of the time we spent putting up noise walls. And again, the neighbors immediately adjacent see the benefit, hear the benefit of those noise walls, but they present another barrier. It's again, an unintended consequence, but something that's recognized. I want to give a shout out to City of Columbus, the Division Neighborhoods. We were at a event probably about a month or so ago over at Sullivan Avenue underneath I-70. I don't know if any of you had a chance to be out there. We partnered with City of Columbus on putting some artwork and murals on the underpass of Sullivan under 70. Also got some lighting installed. We've got 3 or 4 different locations where we've had neighborhood groups come to ODOT and asking about what can we do on these freeway, again, the walls underneath. As Chris mentioned, we have some restrictions as to what we want to have. We don't want to have distractions for the freeway traffic, but certainly some things that can happen to make these crossings look better and make them, again, more familiar and a part of the neighborhood as well.
I think a lot of it, to your point, I think we have, the trouble we've gotten ourselves into is because I think we've focused on the cars being kind of the primary way to get anywhere. And I think we have to shift our focus and make it more human-centric. Think about people walking, think about people biking. How are we connecting these neighborhoods, not just for the convenience of cars, but for the convenience of the pedestrian and for the biker? And when you start to think about that, your sense of scale changes, your sense of what a street should look like, what are the things that you really want on that street as street furniture and all of those things. And I think the moment we start shifting that, you're going to change how those things are designed, and that's going to really make the difference into making them feel more accessible for everyone and also more pleasant to use.
So we did not design the High Street Cap, but we designed the Spring Along bridges and a number of the bridges that are going to be built here. And if you have a building, that's obviously really a great way to capture the pedestrian space, the bike space, make you feel comfortable and not even knowing that you're walking across a highway. But in the places where you don't, a lot of thoughts have gone into our bridge design. So if you think of the Long Street Bridge, the polycarbonate panels are such an improvement over chain link fence. And we would have to do some kind of fencing. We have to get a certain height because you can't throw things over into the roadway. But those panels reduce, you can't see the highway, you don't hear the highway, you don't get the wind, you don't get the salt spray, the noise. I mean, they're really a big improvement. Wider sidewalks, big improvement. Bike lanes on them, improvement. I think we're working as a community to now think about protected bike lanes, even taking it a next step further. Another thing is getting vertical things on the bridge to pull you across. If it's just a kind of empty space, you don't really feel comfortable working through that space, walking through. So if you look at the Spring Street, Long Street bridges, we have vertical elements that kind of anchor different ends of the bridge and through the space, so it kind of pulls you through. There's something interesting to go through. And then green, adding planting material, shrubs. We've tried to get trees. I know not everyone loves having trees on bridges, but they make a huge difference carrying the streetscape that happens on either side of a bridge across the bridge. That's the way you make people not realize they're walking across a highway, and that's the ultimate goal. But there's a lot of different things that go into it, but then you can imagine designing a bridge to be able to handle trees and being able to live and be able to get water and not fall over into the highway are all things we have to worry about, but are all critical components. Lighting, width, space, all these things go into the design of a bridge, and they all cost money. They all have to be maintained, but I think when we say as a community, these are priority things to make these connections for not just cars. You can see the results. Columbus has done it right, and let's keep doing it right.
Just piggyback on that for 2 seconds. When you look at that Long Street overpass, I think it's also important to just highlight the design of the panels in terms of having all the stories of important people that have lived in that neighborhood, and kind of really highlighting that beyond cars, like this is really about people. And it's not some forward-looking thing without precedent, but this is a space in which people have been living their everyday lives for over 100 years now. And you get to walk within that legacy as opposed to this new thing that's just overwritten.
I think that was more, the cultural wall was even more important to the success, I think, than almost anything else, because it made the community feel like this was about them, not just about moving people. And so I think it's critically important. I don't know about Tom, but it's one of the few projects where I've gotten hugs from people in the community when I'm on the bridge. When we were dedicating it, I was getting hugged all the time. It was fantastic. So clearly had an impact personally for people.
The engineer and me was looking, we had 2,000 people show up for that opening, so we were testing the loading of that bridge on day one. But no, it's fantastic. Again, Larry Winston Collins, Como Cajo did a great job as the artists that were selected by the community to pull those stories together, representing, I believe, 10 different facets, whether it's authors, artists, athletes, and again, civic leaders. Just for the community, it's been fantastic.
Say if a similar concept is done for the lead into German Village, you'll get a lot of hugs too. So.
I just got the sign from Doug, so I'm going to ask one more question. But before I do, we're going to move to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. If you have a question, please make your way over to the microphone now. The microphone is back here. And if you're watching online, please type in your questions into the chat. And but before we take those questions, I have one more question for you, and it's something that Benjamin brought up. We're talking about downtown and connecting downtown with the surrounding neighborhoods. But what about building similar bridges or caps even at North Broadway or Weber or 11th or Hudson? Any of those, how doable is that? And should those be done?
The first one that comes to mind for me is 11th. And I think that while the division between like Clintonville and North Linden is important, I think that we have a lot more momentum going for us on a street like 11th, where there's already been a lot of public investment on that intersection at 11 and Cleveland Avenue. And so you could really imagine how you could build infrastructure that really connects the neighborhood going into Ohio State on 11th, and that overpass is definitely due for improvement. And there's a lot of like vacant properties, like commercial land right next to the highway, that really has lost value because it doesn't have any access points. So I think that could easily be a starting point. And I think it's also important, kind of just following up on some of the things I said about access to institutions and services, where I think we need to tell the kids in Linden that Ohio State can be for them. Because right now the space is telling them like stay at home. So.
I just want to add, we like to say that designing a bridge in a rural area over an interstate is a civil engineering problem, and we've gotten very good at that. But designing bridges in urban areas is an urban design problem, and we need to be treating them that way. We need to be thinking them that way, and frankly, we need to be funding them that way. But it's more money, it's more work, but it's definitely worth it. I think what we are doing in Columbus, the Columbus way, what we're doing with this Interbelt, is something that's taking longer than we thought it would, but is something that communities all over our country are looking at. I know our team, people at ODOT in Columbus, we've given many tours on a multiple times a year basis to cities, communities visiting from all over our country that want to see the caps, not just the High Street cap, the Long Street cap. They love hearing about what we're doing. They like to see the different types of bridges and solutions that we have done, and they are taking them because when they look at Clyde Warren Park in Dallas or the Boston Big Dig, the cost of those projects make them almost unattainable. But when they look at what we've done and done it incrementally, they say, this is something we could do in our communities. And I will say, even cities in Central Ohio are looking at these models and now thinking about how they will do their bridges moving forward.
We do get requests for those types of things. You've seen them all around 270, I'm certain. Well, we like that kind of fencing, or we want that kind of lighting, or we want to see these types of bike paths or sidewalks on our bridges. And those requests are being made as part of our civil engineering problem.
I just wanted to make one more statement about that 11th Street corridor. It took me a second to kind of find the landmarks in my head, but there really could be a seamless transition between the Gateway at Ohio State and the intersection of Cleveland and 11th, especially with a cap. And you can imagine how like having the fairgrounds in that middle space, like that experience could really be something that could be defining for Columbus, because there's a lot of significant like public spaces within that, coupled with public investment that's already taken place at both ends. It's really kind of like we just need to connect our own dots.
The only thing I would add to that is I would love to see some kind of a connector that actually you could go between all of our neighborhoods, whether it's a bus or a loop or a light rail. I don't know what it is, but that is something that, again, I feel like you would easily transition from neighborhoods. You could get everywhere very easily. It makes it more accessible, and it's something that we're really missing in Columbus that would benefit, I think, all of the neighborhoods if we were able to.
Thank you. So again, we're going to be taking questions here at the microphone and also online. Lenny Cuthbert is curating all of that. Keep your questions relatively short and make them be a question, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Mark. Denise Brenner asks, will there be additional opportunities for residents to provide their input into these reconnection efforts? And if so, how can you participate and receive an invitation?
Tom and I can talk about this one. This is one of the issues with very large infrastructure projects. The meetings on this stuff started in 2004 and went through about 2008, and the design happened in 2012, 2013. So a lot of these decisions have already been made. I think there's probably some tweaks and revisiting that will be done on a small scale, but I really don't think wholesale opening or revision of the plans at this point is going to happen. But Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Specific to the 7071, Chris is correct. We're probably about 3 or 4 generations of leadership within the German Village Society and the residents associations, but we work through a lot of those representative areas. And again, the Columbus Planning and the Neighborhoods Coalitions as well, to try to get that input. I encourage people to, as you hear about our projects that are coming for an overpass or an underpass on the freeway. Again, we have a lot of projects where we're working right now on Courtright over 70. And a lot of talk about improving the pedestrian crossing there. If anybody's tried to walk across that, I did it once when I was inspecting the bridge and did not want to go back. So those are the kinds of things we're taking in, but as you hear about public meetings for those types of crossings, please get engaged, bring forth, I want to see you did this on such and such another bridge. Why can't you do that here? Or we think that would be a good idea to do that here. That's the kind of input we're looking for as those projects come along.
Hi, my name's Jay Smith. I'm proud to say Harrison Smith was my father. And I just wanted to say to Jeff and Stevie Whitman and everybody else involved, I've been to each one of these, and this one particularly would have thrilled my father. It was exactly the kind of thing he wanted to see more of in downtown. He wanted to see more bright garish lights. He wanted to see more things that caused people to say, huh, what's that? It's brilliant, and we need more of it. But also, as my mother and dad lived in German Village, I've lived there for over 20 years. And I'd like to just point out that the scar between German Village and the Brewery District in downtown created by the freeway is a lot wider than just the freeway. The block between the freeway and Mound Street is dead. It's not going to do an awful lot of good, at least initially, to build a cap over 3rd Street because it's 3 blocks before you come close to anything that anybody would want to walk to anyway. And Chris, nobody knows that better than you. So unlike the Short North, where frankly you had 2 pretty good things to join up, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of gathering developers and gathering developer interest in, and also, frankly, engaging Franklin County to try to undo some of the god-awful damage that they've done on that north shore of I-71, or I-70, if you will.
I'm happy that you mentioned that. When you think about that area, I'm happy you mentioned Mound Street specifically because from an urban fabric perspective, that's probably one of the most layered spaces in Columbus, Central Ohio, if not Ohio at large. When you consider that Mound Street is actually named Mound Street because it was home to Native American burial mounds that have been built over like 4 or 5 times now, going from like the mounds themselves to the early development of the city through this urban renewal period, and now where we're returning. And all of these conversations and thinking about history, when you bring up spaces like that, I think a lot of the complication that we experience in sorting through the best path forward is actually trying to figure out what it was before. And I think that kind of being able to educate ourselves on that space and even be able to get the feedback from people who had experiences before we were here to understand what it is we want to be and what that space can be, and really just living up to the potential of the city.
I just want to mention, and as Jay pointed out, and I think we're all hearing these days, development in these historic neighborhoods has been a big topic of conversation recently. So obviously German Village is very committed to making sure that if we can work with developers to have great and thoughtful designs that do integrate into the neighborhoods, it benefits all of us, and it makes them more attractive to anyone trying to come either live, work, or visit.
So online, excuse me, a question for today. Can any of the panelists speak further about why certain freeway routes through Columbus were chosen and why some neighborhoods were selected and others were spared?
That's a pretty easy follow-up question. A lot of the things that I was mentioning before with this layered space, we have some cultural histories that we've kind of overwritten where we live, and I think that we're all kind of working to grapple with that. But there was a lot of intentionality, like before the highways, even when you think about the redlining maps. When we think of people of color, when we think of redlining, we generally think of black people, but that was actually because there was a ranking system where a lot of our communities were basically put through this matrix to determine who was desirable in the city and who wasn't. And so it would start with groups like black people and then move to groups like Hungarians, Italians, et cetera. And so there was almost a ranking system that determined the significance of the interventions that took place in each neighborhood. And so while there's very clear and almost impermeable divisions between certain neighborhoods, there's spaces in which certain things were left to survive. And a good example of that would actually be at Jefferson Village, where Columbus Landmark's office is. There's a series of brick mansions that were constructed at the turn of the century. And when the original plans for the highway were created, there were groups of people that had capital and influence within the city that actually asked for the highway to be diverted around that corridor so that that space could be preserved. And so there was a large political power struggle and a lot of cultural conflict components that led to the placement of the highways. While Jefferson Village was able to be saved and is actually home to almost exclusively nonprofits now, that actually came at the expense of spaces directly on the opposite side of the highway that had to be built over to protect them. So.
Can any of the panelists provide examples of Columbus neighborhoods or neighborhoods in other cities that are getting their growth right?
I think it's a really tricky question because I think everybody's kind of struggling with it. When you think about cities that Columbus gets compared to most, you think of Austin, Nashville, Charlotte, and all of them have done some things right and some things wrong. And so I think it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. I think you see the things that are working for other cities. Often the most complaint I hear from friends that live in Austin anyway is the traffic, right? It's just crazy. So how can we preempt that here, and are we dealing with that? So I think there are things that we can start to think about now, just lessons learned from where maybe things have not worked out well for other cities, and then maybe try and correct them before we find ourselves in the same situation.
I do think it's something we didn't quite directly address here, but an advantage we have in Columbus compared to many other cities we spend time in is that we have fantastic neighborhoods close into our downtown. A lot of cities don't have the quality of neighborhoods, the quality of building stock still remaining in such proximity. And so one of the reasons the CAPs and these bridge connections are so important is continuing to pull the strength of the neighborhoods into downtown and downtown back into the neighborhoods. And again, Short North Convention Center is the perfect example. Trying to do this now, Brewery District, German Village into downtown. The comment about Mound to Fulton is great. Hopefully if we can get some energy going on with CAPS, that we might get some more development even happening on the south side of downtown. And likewise, as we do the remaining bridges, Oak Town, Maine, connecting Old Town East to the kind of Franklin Park, the Tilbury Park area, also I think should have some power. So again, I think it's really important that we connect our neighborhoods and I think leverage the assets and the strengths we have here in Columbus.
We've seen some other cities actually take out big sections of highway in urban areas, and the famous example is the portion of the highway that was earthquake damaged in San Francisco near the Embarcadero. Can you see a time where we can do that with, say, the semi-redundant portion of 670 that we were talking about earlier that separates Columbus State from Fort Hays?
It's a great point, and some things that have come up as a theme throughout the 20 years as we developed this. I could never say never, and a lot of things have changed in the landscape over that time. But one thing is, was alluded to before, at least in our area for the most part, those freeways are down below grade. Gave us an opportunity to have a hierarchy of roadways. You can have that direct connection with a freeway into and out of downtown, and a lot of things have changed for anyone who's been downtown. We've already spoken about Gay Street, conversions to two-way streets, and making sure that the roadway network has a nice hierarchy, but also can serve multiple purposes. So again, as a traffic engineer, I like the idea of having proximity to freeways downtown and having that functionality there, and then making use of our resources and still being able to connect the neighborhoods so everybody has that access.
I think it's also important to kind of highlight what makes Columbus unique from a lot of comparable cities. And I think that we're at a significant advantage in that the city is very young still. And so when you look at a city like Boston, where it's extremely dense, the Big Dig was necessary in ways that we don't really have problems quite like that. But at the same time, because we don't necessarily have the same resources to invest in an entire cap that runs the length of downtown, I think that we might need to get creative about certain components of the way that we're creating connectivity. Because if you were to kind of compare the surface area of these caps that we're building versus something that you might be able to do in a larger, more mature city like Boston, just throwing stuff out there because we want to be kind of forward-thinking and not just thinking about what has been, but what can be for, we can be the precedent for cities to come. I think that there could be solutions that don't just exclusively involve building, but also kind of finding new modes of transportation. Only because I said it earlier, thinking about 11th, once you get further into Linden, there's several miles where there's not another opportunity on Cleveland Avenue to cross the highway. And so the fairgrounds are right between Ohio State and Linden. Some of our solutions might end up looking like figuring out ways to connect the sky transportation at the state fairgrounds to neighborhoods, those kinds of things, because we really don't have unlimited resources to kind of correct everything the way that it had been before. And so with that, we get to be creative and cutting edge and do some of the fun stuff also. And so if anyone out there has ideas, go with them, yeah.
I want to add one thing quickly. I mean, I think that's a great point. I think Interstate 7071, we're always going to figure out how to accommodate in some form, but whether it's there or not, someday we can maybe have that conversation again. But for everybody in this room that appeals to, we need to be really supporting transit, bike facilities, because if we can move people throughout Columbus and Central Ohio to an extent we aren't in a different way, then we can start having some of those conversations. So things like Link Us, which you're going to be hearing more and more about this coming year, those are the kinds of things we need to support.
And interestingly, here, very, very short question, light rail and streetcars. Following up on your transportation, is there a possibility of that, and do the caps give us more opportunity for something like that in the future?
Yeah, that's always been a big conversation. I think bus rapid transit, high-capacity bus rapid transit, which is what Link Us is what we have to look forward to and we've got a design for and are talking about with things like the Main Street Bridge and other places. So I think that's where it is now. If we can get that right and do that well, then we can talk about things like streetcar and light rail.
And that's actually something that wouldn't be new for the city, but kind of re-implementing some of the infrastructure that already existed before the highways. A lot of the reasons that we actually don't have light rail and streetcars, is because they were kind of removed to make space for automobiles. So when you look at something like on the near east side, the trolley barn, in East Market, that development was our cable car depot. So when we kind of thinking about just reconnecting the history, the space, et cetera, it's not all new necessarily, but at the same time, that might not necessarily be a recoverable history, and it might have to be kind of thinking a little bit more elaborately, because the infrastructure that would be needed to re-implement those systems has actually been pretty like effectively undone.
I have to end things right now. So I think we had a good conversation, but I'm going to turn things over to Kristen.
Thank you, and I hope everyone found today's conversation helpful, because really our future does not have to be guided by the decisions we made in the past. So thank you to our series presenter, the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation, Capital South, and our series sponsor, Thompson Hine. Thank you so much. Thank you to our sponsors of today's program, the Harrison Smith Legacy and Civic Engagement Fund, Smith & Hale, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, and MKSK. And thank you to the Ellis and the Columbus Dispatch for their support. And we're grateful to our virtual seat patrons, the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. And of course, a very special appreciation for today's speakers, Bhakti Banya, Chris Herman, Chris Hune, Benjamin Perryman, Tom Slack, and our host, Mark Ferenchek. Thank you so much. I wish everyone a great holiday season, and we will be back here on January 3rd of 2024, that seems wild to say, for our very first forum of the new year, and it's going to be one of my favorites, the Blue Chip Economic Forecast. So thank you so much. We could not do it without you. Have a great holiday.